"I've never been touched," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips as the rain plastered my hair to my forehead and slicked the city streets into mirrors of fractured light. My boots splashed through puddles, each step echoing in the empty alley behind the cafe where I had spent another 12-hour shift. I could feel it before I saw it, the way the shadows moved differently, deliberate, calculated, like something was observing me with an intensity that made my pulse spike. The neon sign above the diner flickered, casting a pale blue light that reflected off the wet asphalt, making every shadow stretch long and threatening. I hugged my coat tighter, the collar scratching my neck as if reminding me to keep moving, to keep invisible. That's when I saw him, stepping out from behind the black luxury car parked just beyond the alley's curve. He was impossibly tall, every movement precise, fluid, like a predator who had perfected the art of walking through the world unnoticed until he chose to be noticed. The rain caught on his dark suit, beads sliding off the tailored fabric as if it had been painted on. His eyes, the color of storm clouds lit by sudden lightning, locked on mine instantly. The city sounds faded into a hum, every raindrop pounding a rhythm that matched the frantic beat in my chest. My breath caught. I wanted to run, but my legs felt cemented to the slick pavement. He didn't rush me, didn't make a sound except the subtle click of his shoes against the alley's bricks, a sound that might as well have been a countdown. Every instinct screamed to hide, to vanish, yet I stood frozen, mesmerized by the authority radiating from him. The scent of his cologne, sharp with a hint of something I couldn't place, filled the air, grounding me in a strange clarity that made the fear twist into curiosity. He raised one hand slowly, deliberately, not in threat but in command, the gesture impossibly calm for someone who seemed capable of controlling the storm itself. "Emily Carter," he said, the voice low and measured, carrying weight that seemed to make the alley shrink around us. My name on his lips felt like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. I tried to step back, the puddles resisting my movement, my words trapped somewhere in my throat. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though the sound was swallowed by the rain. He smiled, faint, almost imperceptible, and tilted his head as if evaluating not just my presence, but the entirety of who I was. "Vincent Romano," he said, each syllable deliberate, a name heavy with unspoken command. The air between us vibrated with tension, a mix of fear and fascination that made every nerve ending in my body alert. "You've been careful, haven't you?" he asked, eyes narrowing slightly, scanning me as if I were an equation to be solved. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze fully, my mind racing through all the stories I'd heard of men like him, of power that could crush or protect in the same instant. He stepped closer, and the space between us shrank, yet I felt no immediate threat, only an undeniable force pressing against the edges of my consciousness. The rain continued to hammer the rooftops, the streetlights flickered, and in that suspended moment, I realized that something about this encounter, this impossibly tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit with eyes that seemed to see everything, was about to change everything I had ever known about danger, control, and the boundaries between fear and belonging. The alley stretched behind me, slick with rain and littered with scraps of paper and puddles reflecting the dull glow of distant streetlights. Every step I took seemed amplified, each splash a drumbeat in my ears, marking time against the rapid thrum of my pulse. Vincent stood there, impossibly still, the fine cut of his suit pressed against his tall frame, his hands relaxed but purposeful at his sides, the quiet of the night seeming to gather around him like a cloak. I wanted to move, to turn and vanish into the maze of streets I had memorized over years of late shifts and hurried walks home, but my feet felt rooted to the wet asphalt. A flicker of lightning illuminated the alley, casting a brief, stark light that etched every line of his face into my memory, the sharpness of his jaw, the way his eyes held both calculation and something deeper, almost like a question. He did not speak immediately, just let the silence stretch, letting the rain hammer out its own rhythm, each drop striking the hood of the car like distant drums. Finally, he tilted his head slightly and gestured with one hand, smooth, deliberate, a signal that made the space between us feel charged with anticipation. "Walk with me," he said, his voice calm, a contrast to the storm around us, and I found myself moving despite the weight in my chest, following the sound of it. The streets were nearly empty, the neon of closed shops reflecting in pools along the curbs, turning the city into a fractured mirror world. He matched my pace without hurry, his presence large enough that even with space between us, I could feel the gravity of him pulling at my awareness. Every glance he cast around, subtle and measured, suggested an awareness of everything around us, and yet he seemed completely focused on my small, hesitant steps beside him. I could not tell if it was curiosity or caution driving him, or some careful blend of both, but the effect was undeniable. I felt both exposed and oddly protected, caught between fear and a strange sense of being observed for reasons that were not entirely threatening. The sound of the rain softened as we passed under a flickering street lamp, and I caught the scent of his cologne again, sharp but clean, a scent that lingered like a signature in the air around him. "Why are you following me?" I finally asked, the words trembling slightly, but carrying enough of a challenge to make my own voice firm. He considered me briefly, the shadow of a smile brushing his lips. "Because you are remarkable," he said simply, as if that explanation were both enough and not enough at the same time. My heart lurched at the word, its weight pressing into the middle of my chest, and I kept walking, unsure whether the next step would take me towards something I wanted or away from everything I had known. The alley opened onto a small street lined with closed shops and empty benches, the city quieting around us in the aftermath of the storm. Vincent slowed slightly, keeping pace just behind me, letting me sense the authority he carried without overtly imposing it. Every step was measured, deliberate, and I realized with a start that I was learning the rhythm of him without knowing it, moving in tandem through a world that suddenly felt larger and more defined by his presence. The lights above flickered again, and he finally spoke, softer this time, almost intimate in the way the words carried across the wet air. "Do not be afraid of me, Emily. That is the first step in understanding the rest." My breath caught, a mix of relief and continued tension, and I nodded, unsure how much of that I was following and how much was simply instinct, letting my gaze wander just enough to acknowledge the way the city seemed transformed by our steps, the storm's residue turning ordinary streets into something cinematic, something impossible to forget. The quiet street led us toward a small plaza, its fountain still glistening from the storm, water droplets catching the residual glow of the streetlights and turning each splash into a tiny prism of color. I could feel the tension lingering in my shoulders, every nerve alert as Vincent moved beside me with the same careful precision that had made the alley seem like a stage for some unseen choreography. The wet pavement reflected his figure in perfect symmetry, his black suit absorbing the light yet somehow commanding it to define the space around him. I noticed details I had not before, the slight crease in his sleeve that suggested a meticulous attention to appearance, the way his shoes barely made a sound as they met the ground, and the faintest shift in his posture whenever I faltered in my steps. He was a study in controlled movement, each gesture deliberate, yet entirely natural, as if the city itself had slowed down to accommodate his pace. I kept my eyes on the uneven bricks beneath my feet, my heart attempting to regulate its frantic beat while my mind raced, cataloging every feature, every scent, every sound, each one amplifying the reality of him standing beside me. We reached a small bench near the fountain, its surface slick and gleaming, and he gestured toward it, a silent invitation that I hesitated to accept. I sat cautiously, noticing the way his eyes continued to observe without judgment, scanning for more than just appearance, as if measuring intentions, evaluating character through an unspoken language I did not know I could read. The water in the fountain shimmered, droplets leaping as if participating in some silent conversation with the light and our presence. Vincent crouched slightly, not imposing, merely adjusting his position to bring a subtle weight to the interaction, one that spoke of attentiveness rather than dominance. "You are cautious," he said finally, voice a calm anchor in the soft symphony of water and distant city hum, "and you should be. Most people do not see what lies beneath the surface." The word settled around me like a tangible presence, and I felt the tension in my chest ease just a fraction, replaced by an almost unnameable curiosity. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting his, and found that the storm in his eyes had calmed to something akin to clarity, a sharp intelligence softened by measured observation. "Why me?" I asked quietly, my voice barely carrying above the fountain's gentle roar, but enough to command attention. He studied me for a moment, the faintest expression of acknowledgement passing across his features, and then said, "Because you notice things that others overlook. Because you move through the world with care and purpose, even when you think no one is watching." My heart caught at the words, not in fear this time, but in realization that the observation was not invasive but discerning, recognizing a depth I had not allowed myself to show. The city around us seemed to contract, focusing all attention on the small square, the glistening fountain, and the two figures moving with an unspoken rhythm between caution and understanding. Vincent extended a hand, subtle, measured, a gesture that conveyed both invitation and reassurance. I hesitated, then placed my hand lightly in his, sensing the steadiness beneath the warmth and control, a tether of mutual recognition forming in that quiet, rain-washed plaza. The water shimmered, reflecting the interaction in fractal patterns across the ground, and for the first time, I felt the weight of his presence not as a threat, but as a guiding force in a night that had begun with uncertainty and ended with a fragile but undeniable connection. The plaza opened into a quiet street lined with tall buildings whose windows glimmered with the reflections of the lingering rain, streetlights stretching thin, pale beams across the slick sidewalks. I walked beside Vincent, each of my steps measured and deliberate, trying to keep pace with the silent rhythm he set, a rhythm that seemed both natural and precise, dictating the movement of the night itself. The city air smelled of wet asphalt, a hint of coffee from a nearby cafe drifting faintly across the street, blending with the subtle scent of his cologne that lingered around him like an invisible halo. My hands, still damp from the rain, fidgeted lightly with the strap of my bag, my pulse echoing in my ears as my mind tried to anticipate what would come next. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, a presence so commanding that it felt like the night itself was attuned to his breathing, the soft tap of his shoes on the pavement, and the occasional ripple of water in a gutter. Finally, his voice cut through the quiet, low, deliberate, not demanding but impossible to ignore. "The city has a rhythm, Emily. You feel it, even when you do not see it." I looked up at him, intrigued despite the lingering uncertainty, the streetlight casting a glow that highlighted the sharp angles of his face, the intensity in his eyes that seemed to measure and weigh each step I took beside him. We turned a corner, and the street widened slightly, revealing a small park beyond, its benches and leafless trees glistening under the wet sheen of the night. He gestured toward it, not asking, just indicating with a tilt of his hand, and I understood the invitation. I stepped onto the pathway, my shoes making soft splashes in the puddles as we moved, and he followed, the sound of his movements almost imperceptible, blending into the ambient noise of dripping water and distant traffic. "People rarely see beyond the immediate," he said, watching me from the corner of his eyes, "yet everything matters, even the smallest choices. They echo." I nodded slowly, absorbing the words, sensing the weight behind them without fully understanding, a gravity that made the night feel dense and full of possibility. A breeze shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth, and I realized that in his presence, every detail seemed magnified, the shimmer of the wet leaves, the glint of light on the pavement, the small, almost imperceptible movements of the city itself. He stopped briefly beside a fountain, its water stilling in the cold air, and I paused too, caught between wanting to understand and feeling the pull of something larger than myself. "You notice things," he said, voice soft, "things others miss. That is why you are here." The simplicity of the statement settled over me, a mixture of reassurance and challenge that made the air feel charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. I drew in a careful breath, the mist of the fountain touching my face, and lifted my gaze to meet his, realizing that the night, the city, and the space between us had shifted, shaping a new awareness that was both unnerving and strangely comforting, a silent acknowledgement that the steps I had taken beside him were the beginning of a path I could neither predict nor resist. The path led us to a quiet bridge overlooking the river, its steel beams slick and shining under the reflection of distant city lights. I kept my steps light, almost hesitant, the sound of the water flowing below blending with the occasional hum of a passing car and the soft patter of residual raindrops from the rooftops. Vincent walked beside me, silent, his presence like a steady anchor in the shifting rhythm of the city night. Every movement he made was precise, controlled, yet natural, as if the bridge itself had been built to accommodate him, to frame him against the expanse of water and light. I glanced at him, noticing the subtle way his eyes scanned the surroundings, assessing, observing, without judgment but with an intensity that made the air between us feel alive, charged with unspoken expectation. The wind carried the faint scent of wet earth and distant coffee, mingling with the subtle, clean cologne that clung to him like a shadow. "Do you come here often?" I asked, my voice tentative, almost drowned by the water, yet carrying enough to break the silence that had grown thick around us. He tilted his head, a small, deliberate movement, and let out a quiet, almost imperceptible sound that felt like acknowledgement. "Rarely. Only when I need clarity. The city has a way of becoming noisy in ways you cannot always see." His voice was calm, steady, drawing my attention as if it carried a weight beyond the simple words. I absorbed them, sensing the layers of meaning beneath, the suggestion that the moments we shared were not random, that each step, each gesture, held intention beyond my understanding. The bridge swayed slightly under a passing breeze, the cables humming softly, and I realized I was acutely aware of every detail, the glint of the water, the cold steel under my fingertips as I adjusted my grip on the railing, the way his presence made the space around me feel expanded and compressed all at once. "Why am I here?" I asked again, searching for clarity in the midst of the uncertainty that had marked the night. He looked at me, eyes sharp yet measured, the storm of earlier intensity softened into something like understanding. "Because you notice things others do not. Because you move with intention, even when unseen. That makes you rare." My chest tightened at the words, a mixture of anxiety and something else, an unexpected recognition, a thread of connection forming in the quiet expanse of the bridge. We stood for a moment, the water below shimmering with reflections, the city lights dancing across the surface, and I felt a strange calm in the midst of my lingering tension. He did not move closer, did not reach out, yet his presence filled the space as if tethering me to a rhythm I did not know existed. The night stretched quietly around us, and in that suspended moment, I realized that the city, the storm, and the stranger beside me had shifted something inside me, a subtle but undeniable shift that made me aware of a world larger, more intricate, and infinitely more alive than I had known in my solitary footsteps through the rain-soaked streets. We continued along the river walk, the city lights reflecting off the gentle ripples of the water, creating a mosaic of color that danced with each step we took. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of wet concrete and lingering rain, a reminder of the storm that had passed hours before. Vincent moved with a quiet confidence beside me, each step measured and exact, yet somehow effortless, as if he had walked these streets countless times while remaining unseen. I could not help but notice the subtle details, the way the light caught the edges of his suit, the careful alignment of his posture, the way his eyes seemed to capture every shadow and movement around us without a hint of tension. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my own breathing, to steady the rapid flutter in my chest, but it seemed impossible with the awareness of his presence pressing softly against the edges of my consciousness. "Emily," he said at last, his voice low, even, carrying a weight that made the night feel denser, more immediate, "it is important to observe, to understand the patterns around you. It is not merely curiosity, it is preparation." I glanced at him, intrigued, sensing the layers of meaning behind his words, the careful choice of phrasing that suggested both instruction and subtle challenge. The river flowed silently beside us, its surface disturbed only by the occasional drop from the eaves of nearby buildings, the gentle rhythm merging with the distant hum of traffic. I followed his gaze and realized he was noting every detail, the way the shadows formed under the lampposts, the subtle shifts in light across the water, the patterns of movement in the sparse crowd still lingering from the storm. A faint breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of baked bread from a nearby late-night bakery, mingling with the faint trace of his cologne that seemed to linger just beyond the reach of the cool air. "Why does it matter?" I asked, my voice tentative, yet audible, breaking the silence that had settled between us. He did not answer immediately, allowing the words to hang, letting the space itself provide weight and context. Then he spoke, deliberate and calm, because understanding the environment allows you to navigate it with intention. To move without hesitation, to act without regret. That awareness is what separates those who simply exist from those who command their path. I nodded slowly, the clarity in his voice and presence settling a subtle reassurance over the tension that had been coiling in my chest. We moved on, the riverwalk curving gently, benches and planters glinting with residual water, and I felt a growing sense of rhythm between our steps, an unspoken coordination that made the night feel both expansive and intimate. I realized that his guidance, though quiet and unobtrusive, was shaping my awareness, drawing me into a larger perception of the world around us, and I felt the first spark of trust forming, cautious yet undeniable, a connection woven into the stillness of the post-storm city and the presence of a man whose attention, though intense, felt protective rather than invasive, grounding me in the certainty that these moments, small and measured, were laying the foundation for something I had not yet fully understood but could not ignore. The riverwalk curved into a quieter section of the city, the buildings on either side towering and reflective, catching the dim glow of streetlights and scattering it across the wet pavement. I kept my gaze on the path ahead, but every so often, I could feel Vincent's presence just to my side, a steady, commanding weight that seemed to shape the space around us. The air carried the subtle scent of wet stone and faint traces of coffee from a nearby open cafe, mingling with the lingering aroma of his cologne, clean and grounding, pulling my awareness toward him even as I tried to focus on my own steps. We passed benches slick with rain, their metal edges catching the light, and the quiet hum of distant traffic created a low, steady rhythm beneath the soft trickle of water from the eaves above. "You have been cautious tonight," he said, his voice calm but firm, the words carrying through the night like measured beats, "and that is wise. Observation is the first step toward understanding." I nodded, sensing the layers in what he said, the subtle guidance embedded in the calm authority of his tone. Each step beside him felt deliberate, as if we were moving in tandem to a rhythm I could not yet name but was slowly beginning to recognize. The bridge overhead reflected in the river below, the steel framework a dark silhouette against the shimmer of the water, and I noticed how every detail seemed magnified in his presence, the angles of the streetlights, the patterns of rainwater on the pavement, the faint echoes of footsteps behind us. "Do you always notice so much?" I asked, my voice soft, cautious, breaking the silence that had settled around us without disturbing it. He glanced at me, a slight tilt of his head, his eyes catching the reflection of the river as though measuring the distance between thought and observation. "Attention to detail is a skill," he said, "and it is the difference between wandering aimlessly and moving with purpose. You are learning, even if you do not realize it." The words settled around me, and I felt a subtle shift within myself, a quiet recognition that the night had transformed from simple darkness and rain into something structured, deliberate, and filled with unspoken understanding. The wind stirred, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and the faintest trace of the city's life beyond the empty streets, and I felt a strange combination of alertness and calm, as though the presence beside me anchored the chaos of the world into a single point of focus. Vincent slowed slightly, matching my pace to ease the rhythm of our movement, and I noticed that he was not simply leading but calibrating, ensuring that the space between us allowed for both observation and interaction. The river shimmered under the scattered light, creating fractals that danced across the surface, and I realized that every step, every glance, and every subtle motion was shaping the night into an experience that was both instructive and strangely reassuring. I drew a careful breath, the cool air filling my lungs, and understood that this walk, these steps beside him, were not merely passage through the city but a lesson in perception, in presence, in understanding the weight of observation, and I felt the first, tentative spark of trust forming, fragile yet undeniable, linking my awareness to the steady, commanding rhythm of the man beside me. We turned away from the river and followed a narrow cobblestone street that wound its way toward the older section of the city, the stones slick with residual rain, reflecting the muted glow of the streetlights above. Every step I took felt heightened, my senses attuned to the subtle sounds of the city, the soft scuff of our shoes, the distant hum of a late-night tram, the occasional drip of water from a fire escape. Vincent walked beside me, silent, commanding the space without overt action, his presence a constant that seemed to make the shadows themselves shift in response. I noticed the details in the folds of his suit, the way the lapels caught the light, the meticulous alignment of his posture, and the steady, even cadence of his steps, a rhythm that I unconsciously began to match. "Emily," he said softly, the sound of his voice cutting through the quiet with a gentle authority, "understanding is not passive. Observation and comprehension must guide your every action." I lifted my eyes to him, sensing the layers behind his words, a lesson embedded in the calmness and precision of his tone. The street opened into a small square, cobblestones glistening under the last lingering drops of rain, surrounded by low brick buildings with warm lights spilling from windows. He paused near the center of the square, motioning for me to stop with a subtle tilt of his hand, and I did, noticing how he evaluated the space with a quiet intensity, every angle, every reflection of light seemingly mapped in his mind. I felt the first trace of understanding in my chest, a recognition that he was teaching not through instruction but through presence, through the careful shaping of experience. "Do you feel it?" he asked, voice calm but probing, "the weight of choice in every step you take, the influence of awareness on the path you follow?" I nodded, words catching in my throat, realizing that the question itself carried more than curiosity, it carried expectation and insight. The square was silent except for the occasional drip of water from the eaves and the distant murmurs of a night shift worker, yet in the stillness, the city seemed alive, every surface reflecting a new understanding I had not noticed before. Vincent shifted his weight slightly, the motion imperceptible, yet it carried a subtle authority, signaling attention, patience, and guidance. "This is why observation matters," he continued, "because it allows you to move deliberately, to act with understanding instead of impulse. It is the difference between wandering and mastery." I felt the weight of his words settle over me, a steady anchor in the midst of uncertainty, and I realized that each careful step we had taken together, each glance, each measured pause, had been a part of a larger pattern, teaching me the value of awareness, perception, and the quiet power of presence. The lights in the windows reflected in the wet stones around us, fractals of color and motion, and I understood, without fully knowing how, that these moments, guided by him, were shaping a new understanding of the world and my place within it, a fragile but undeniable trust weaving between us as the night carried us forward into spaces I had never truly noticed before. The street narrowed, guiding us through a tunnel of dimly lit buildings, their brick walls slick from the rain and glinting in the scattered glow of distant lamps. I walked beside Vincent, careful to match his pace, aware of the quiet rhythm he imposed, a rhythm that seemed to anchor the night itself. The sounds of the city were distant now, replaced by the soft murmur of water from a nearby gutter and the occasional creak of metal fire escapes overhead. Every detail felt magnified, the uneven stones beneath our feet, the faint aroma of damp concrete mixing with the lingering scent of his cologne, and the way his shadow stretched alongside mine, steady and unyielding. He stopped beneath a single streetlight, letting the pool of light illuminate both of us, and I noticed the meticulous control in every line of his posture, the way his shoulders squared, the subtle tension in his hands, relaxed but deliberate. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet street, "what we do is not defined by the paths already taken but by the awareness we bring to each step. Every choice, every observation matters." I drew a careful breath, sensing the weight behind the words, the authority imbued in the calmness of his tone. The night seemed to pause with us, the city shrinking around this moment, the distant hum of traffic softened to a backdrop of quiet anticipation. I realized that each step we had taken together, each measured movement and silent exchange, had been part of a larger lesson, teaching awareness, perception, and subtle influence over the environment. The air carried the faint scent of wet leaves from a nearby planter, and the occasional rustle of a bird settling into the eaves broke the stillness in gentle, rhythmic pulses. I looked at Vincent, noting how he observed everything yet gave nothing away, a presence that demanded attention without needing to assert it forcefully. "Do you trust the path you are on?" he asked, the question more a reflection than a query, encouraging thought rather than demanding an answer. I nodded slowly, feeling the first solid trace of confidence settle alongside the curiosity and caution that had carried me through the night. He stepped closer, the space between us charged not with threat but with the subtle gravity of guidance, and I sensed the invisible tether that had formed, binding my awareness to his presence. The streetlight flickered above, momentarily casting shadows that danced across the wet pavement, highlighting the contours of the city and our place within it. Vincent's gaze met mine, steady and unwavering, and I understood without words that the night had become a teaching ground, a space where observation, attention, and the quiet power of presence converged. Each breath I took seemed synchronized with his, each step forward a continuation of the lesson in subtlety, control, and awareness, and I felt a tentative, yet undeniable connection forming in the stillness, a bond woven through shared understanding, trust, and the silent rhythm of the rain-washed city around us.